All right, well, good morning, everybody. My name is Dennis Bernstein. I'm the VP of Commercial Insurance here at PIASC Insurance Services. We are grateful today to have Dan Stover of Insight Partners talking to us about, in this case, managing meetings. Dan can talk about a lot of different things, and will and has. I've known Dan for a few years and have always found his counsel and advice to be top-notch. He works with leaders of companies in various sizes and is able to get them to be more productive, better leaders, and so the organizations they run are much more efficient and much more successful. I will turn it over to Dan and allow him an opportunity to share his insights for the next 30 minutes. We do record these webinars, so you can catch them on our website. You can also catch them on our YouTube channel, Southland Review, and then we will be sending it out to everybody as for an opportunity for you to listen to it in an on-demand setting. So thanks, and Dan, take it over.
Thank you so much, Dennis. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you all for being here today, for coming to a meeting about meetings, which is actually something more helpful and effective than maybe it would sound at face value. When it comes to managing meetings, this is something in my consulting practice as an organizational psychologist I regularly find myself having to address, meaning how meetings are run, why meetings are held, the interpersonal dynamics that play out during a meeting. It seems to be that our business culture has just led to a time and place where we expect to be in meetings all of the time, or are expected to be in meetings all of the time, without really addressing how the meetings are actually being run, how effective they are, how substantive they are. So for the next 30 minutes, I'd like to give you just a higher level overview of the mindset that's required to start having more effective meetings at your organization or within your team. So by the end here, you should have some really strong psychological reference points and a frame of mind to approach how you run meetings, which is where this all starts. So being an organizational psychologist, I think the most important thing I can tell you at the outset is anytime we're trying to make a change as an individual or within our team or across an entire organization, it always starts in the mind, the way we perceive things, the way we think about things, the way we define things are often important, if not the most critical factor in making a change. So that's my preface to all of this. And I want to start by making a business case for talking about meetings at all. So why are we having a webinar on meetings? These are some of the stats I pulled up. Every single day in the US, there's somewhere between 36 and 56 million business meetings. Up to 69% of those meetings suffer interruptions that impact the effectiveness of the meeting. So when we think about interruptions, that's a good place to pause and define what those could be. Those could be people showing up late, people leaving early, people interrupting one another as we think of it conversationally. And that can also be the all too common emailing, texting. I'm shocked at how many C-suite meetings I've been in and catch executives checking Facebook and social media during a meeting, which is an indicator that there's something wrong within the meeting, or there's something that the individual is struggling with, therefore having to distract themselves. Also, meetings have increased in length and frequency, meaning managers are spending upwards of 23 hours a week in them. If I could see all of you, I would ask for a show of hands, but when I've given this presentation live in person, I've found many people say that would be nice to only have 23 hours a week in meetings, that it's actually even more than that. So when you think of trying to establish work-life balance, if the expectation is minimum 23 hours a week in a meeting, we're going to start running into problems. Similar to the comment about interruptions, almost all of us admit to multitasking during meetings. So that means only 8% of us are often entirely focused to the present moment in a meeting. 92% of us are elsewhere, either on our devices, in our mind, or in a notepad scribbling things down to buy at the grocery store after work, or reminders to pick up the kids, something like that. But most of us are trying to multitask during meetings, which I hope most of you know, if not all of you know, multitasking is not how the brain works. We have a brain that's designed for unitasking, even though it's very hard to do. So that leads to interruptions and a lack of productivity. A study from the Harvard Business Review showed that 71% of our meetings are rated unproductive. And I thought most interestingly, directly linked to turnover, decreased market share, and of course, reduced productivity. So I find that very interesting that unproductive meetings are directly linked to turnover, and especially in a competitive marketplace right now for jobs, that's crucially important. And then finally, putting it into dollar signs, these unproductive meetings cost the US economy between $70 and $283 billion a year. The range on that is so wide because there's no real strong way to get a more precise number, because there's no real way to track every company in the United States, every nonprofit organization in the United States, and have an exact statistical data on how many meetings they're having and what each executive in that room makes per hour. So that's why you see $70 to $283 billion. But nevertheless, that's an extreme dollar amount when you think of 71% of our meetings are rated unproductive, and then the associated cost. Put that at a micro level, at the very end, you'll have a link to a meeting calculator from the Harvard Business Review that I've linked. And you can actually calculate the cost of your meetings in dollars based on the salaries of everybody in the room, how long the meeting lasts, and how frequent that meeting is, meaning weekly or monthly. And these are terms we don't typically think of meetings in, meaning we don't think about the dollar amount often associated with meetings. And if we did more frequently, so here's a mindset piece, if we thought about the dollar amount attributed to meetings more often, I believe we would have a higher level of focus on making sure the meeting is in fact productive. Which begs the question, why hold a meeting? This is something I find few people and few organizations ask themselves or use as a constructive way of pushing back when meetings are in fact unproductive. So I think first, at a baseline level, a company or an organization or a team has to acknowledge and accept that we could do better when it comes to running and facilitating our meetings. However that looks, it could be making them less interruptive, making them more focused, it could be having an agenda, it could be making sure people are on time, it could be the content of the meeting, meaning we're trying to do too many things at once in a meeting, or too few things at once in a meeting. But then you can ask, why are we holding this meeting? Why are we here? And that's something that's worth asking, because there's a pattern over the last 8 years that I've seen in why we hold a meeting if we're not thinking about it. So what we know is our unconscious mind, left to its own devices, has all kinds of bad habits that manifest, right? Well, my opinion and professional experience is that meetings are one of the consequences or manifestations of really just not thinking about this question. Why am I holding this meeting? So there's a little acronym there, WHAM, for short. I thought about putting George Michael on this slide, but I'd settled for a little cartoon. So why hold a meeting? On the left-hand side here, we have the unconscious bad habits of why we hold a meeting in an organization. The first being because we've always met for an hour. I've been shocked at how many organizations and teams are simply used to showing up at the same place at the same time for an hour, whether or not they have anything to talk about, whether or not they've had an agenda, but because psychologically and emotionally and behaviorally, we are creatures of habit. This because we've always met, and keeping it to an hour is just a piece of the status quo we uphold, whether or not we're actually being productive. So that's a reason not to hold a meeting. The next reason we unconsciously hold a meeting, but shouldn't, is to share general information. We are inundated with email, which is a whole other conversation. However, general updates and general information that could otherwise be read is sometimes a reason we hold a meeting and bring people together. Now, there could be other motivations to that. However, if it can go in an email, it should. Now, that leads to an entirely separate conversation about the expectation of reading email, which I know is also a problem in many companies. But there again is another conversation and mindset shift that we would have to encourage and ultimately adopt in the teams that we are participate in. The third reason we unconsciously hold a meeting is similar to the second. It's to catch up, meaning we are social creatures that have a psychological and emotional need to belong, and we spend the most amount of hours in our day in the workplace. So inevitably, our need to belong is expressed at work. And sometimes we just like to get together and are motivated to have a meeting because it's a chance to socialize and catch up with each other a little bit. I've heard many organizations say in this discussion, I look forward to coming to these meetings whether or not we get anything done, because it's the only time all of us are in the room together. And it's just nice to know I'm not on an island after all. I'm not in a silo after all. But, you know, when you think of the workplace environment, we have to find a way to honor that interest in being on a team and need to belong, but also be productive. So it's just being aware of whether or not this is in fact a motivation on your team. And sometimes it's not, but know that it is, and then do something with it to complement the catching up and belonging aspect. An example of this, one engineering firm I work with starts every meeting, every monthly leadership meeting, with a new question that provokes some kind of vulnerability, and they go around the room and everybody shares, what was your favorite board game as a kid and why? What was one of your greatest life lessons? Just a reflective, simple question that you wouldn't expect at a business meeting. And that's how they honor catching up with one another. And then they get down to brass tacks, as they say. And then finally, the other unconscious reason we hold a meeting is more driven by the person who holds the meeting, but not necessarily just them. It's for a soapbox, meaning I have a personal opinion or I have a personal interest that I need to disclose, or I want everybody to know. It's very I-driven, it's very selfish-driven. I want to tell you, or I want to tell the room what I think and what my opinion is, which is a really slippery slope when it comes to the purpose of a meeting, because one of the key ground rules in holding an effective meeting is that all of the participants must only debate and must only argue for what's in the best interest of the organization, and what's in the best organization, or excuse me, what's in the best interest of the people the organization serves. And when you start getting these strong I statements that are personal interest and personal agenda oriented, the meetings derail instantly. In some cultures, this is very normalized, meaning everybody's arguing on their personal opinion and personal interest, and we're kind of used to that because we're socially conditioned in some way to be used to that. And this is one of the first things I intervene on in organizations that have this problem, is no more arguing on personal interest or opinion. If you're going to say something that's constructive and meant to spur debate, it has to be on the behalf of the whole and the betterment of the whole, or for those that you're serving. So on the contrary, what's the alternative to this? If these are our 4 most consistent bad habits in running a meeting, or why holding a meeting, what are their counterparts? Number 1 is my favorite as a touchy-feely psych guy in the workplace. It's to create healthy discourse and come up with a direction and strategy, which maybe this next sentence should be bolded, ensuring the diversity of thought and perspective. So I assume all or most of you know that we are guilty of homogeny of thought pretty often, meaning we fall into groupthink, where everybody is more inclined to agree just to unconsciously fit into the norm rather than debate or create purposeful discourse. There's been some promotion of this over the years. Fortunately, there's an encouragement for people to play devil's advocate. That's the same idea here when I say discourse and diversity and thought of perspective. It has to be acceptable in the team and in the meeting to play devil's advocate and assume that role. Now, my favorite thing that happens that creates a lot of change in teams is the person who's least likely to do this step up and start. So if you're one of the people who are least likely to speak or make waves, what a grand opportunity here. And disclose what you're doing. Say, hey, I want to play devil's advocate, but purposefully so. I think I have a perspective just in the best interest of the whole organization here. Let me play devil's advocate and see how it goes. So you can set yourself up through prefacing to communicate this in a meeting to make it go more effectively. The next is to make informed decisions about projects, a launch, strategy, or goals, meaning you need all of the brain power in the room from everyone on the team that's in the meeting or in the diverse expertise at the C-suite, but we need everybody's brain power to actually make an informed decision, and the meeting should end with a decision, which doesn't happen very often. Like many meetings just collect a bunch of data and then a decision is made outside the meeting. The decision needs to be made right then and there if possible. Third is more of the bonding piece. It's to build or strengthen a team's capabilities or cohesion. In that example with a meeting starting with a vulnerable share is one of the lowest hanging fruits you can grab there, is starting a meeting with a time restricted round the room share of some kind. And the facilitator or leader of the meeting can come up with that question every month. People can take turns, but a good reason to hold a meeting is to strengthen a team's cohesion. And again, we need that kind of team. We need that camaraderie. We need that sense of belonging at work psychologically and emotionally, because we don't turn off our emotions when we come to work. Whether we'd like to or not is a different story, but we can't. And then finally, a great reason to hold a meeting is to process emotionally charged or difficult information. So actually that same company that I just referenced that does the vulnerable share experienced a death a couple of weeks ago as well. And rather than people finding out through the grapevine, rather than sending out a mass email, an emergency meeting was called. Phones were called for people who were not in the office that day to let everyone know there had been a death in the company. And that was a perfectly executed way to bring people together, to show that we honor and respect the people that work for us, and we want you to hear this from us first and have a place where you can process. And with such an extreme example, emotions are welcome. You know, it's kind of the opposite of how we would normally think about a meeting, but that was an actual space they created for grieving, so to speak. That's not normal in the workplace, but highly effective if you're thinking about why are we holding this meeting and what is it supposed to do for us. So the short summary of this is know unconsciously why a meeting is being held and why you're showing up to a meeting, and then see in your organizations if you can move it toward these healthier 4 options that are a little more conscious and much more deliberate. So deliberate is the key word in moving from the left column to the right column. So the important stuff to consider here in terms of improving meetings at just a very high level. Number 1 is effective facilitation. Most of us received 0 training on how to run a meeting, and making sure we're equipping ourselves with those facilitation skills, and meaning like one of the most crucial that goes overlooked is how to directly but respectfully address someone who's being disruptive in a group setting in real time. It's one of the biggest challenges we face when we're running a meeting is, what do you do with that person who's being the disruptor, and how do you acknowledge them and call them forth in such a way, since you're in a public setting, that is respectful but gets to the point. And this is something that we all need to learn if we're going to hold meetings accountable, because we're all human and we all have bad habits, right? 92% of us are distracted and multitasking in a meeting. How do you call that out? How do you normalize calling it out? So that's what I mean by effective facilitation, which also dovetails nicely into creating discourse and conflict. There's 2 kinds of organizations I tend to find in my line of work. There's the type of organization that in a meeting, everybody's afraid to make waves. So there's absolutely no discourse and conflict. And then all of the conflict happens in the hallway and behind closed doors, and people are talking about each other, but not talking to each other in a constructive way. And it's really unproductive and leads to like a really passive aggressive culture. The alternative is highly conflictual meetings and teams, where again, like kind of that personal interest, personal opinion, emotional outburst driven type of normalization. And people are just kind of at each other's throats all the time. People are just very aggressive in how they communicate. And inevitably some just kind of adopt it and get used to it and, you know, step up in a bad way, and play along, while the rest of people just shut down and they just put up with it, so to speak. Which leads to the next point. We need to be very conscious of the psychological safety in the room. And we have Google to thank for a landmark study when they ask themselves what creates, or what's the common denominator in our highest performing teams. At Google, psychological safety was the answer, meaning people were able to give each other feedback. Everybody had a chance to speak. People who are not inclined to speak were invited to by someone else in the meeting. They were asked for their thoughts. And most importantly, which I find to be the most novel and where I spend the most time in organizations, is people are compelled to self-disclose the mistakes or errors they made in judgment or in a process for the benefit of the whole room. Now imagine that for a second. You're sitting in a meeting with all your peers and people are excited to share where they screwed up because everyone in the room will benefit from hearing it and processing it so that we can do better next time. That's the unicorn we're going for in terms of psychological safety. And then finally, this one's almost like kind of a check mark best practice, making sure you're engaging the people remotely. Meaning, if it's meant to be a conversational environment, are we using video? If we're using a conference line and it's voice only, are we regularly calling on the people on the conference line to contribute and making sure those remote people feel engaged? And this is a challenge that's always going to continuously grow given the virtual and remote and flexible work environments we're creating. On the other side, making sure people are accountable. I can't, on a baseline, I can't tell you how often I find people are not told explicitly they're expected to show up on time and stay for the duration of the meeting. Like, this is non-negotiable. But the trade-off is it's got to be purposeful, right? So creating accountability in the meetings is key. Next, there's got to be a clear purpose and direction for the meeting. A best practice there is to actually state it. State at the beginning of the meeting what we're trying to accomplish today and work toward it and execute it at the end. And to do that, most people find they have to have a quality agenda. It could be simple, could be just a couple key items, but it moves us through the steps that's required for that clear purpose and direction. And then finally, what's the follow-up? Who's taking notes and who sends an email to everybody at the end of the meeting that says, this is what you are all on the hook for. Bobby's on the hook for X and we'll have that delivered by Y. Susie is on the hook for X and we'll deliver it by Y. Just what are they supposed to accomplish and by when, which those follow-ups should inform the agenda of the next meeting, and that's how progress is made. So eliminating bad meetings, these two columns were separated purposefully, meaning when you're focusing on accountability, having a clear purpose and direction, a quality agenda, and following up is how you create accountability in how the meetings are run. In terms of facilitating effectively, your considerations are psychological safety, making sure there's healthy discourse, and engaging people that are participating remotely. So I just want to simplify this so that if you're focusing on accountability or you're focusing on effective facilitation, you know what you're looking at. You know the meat of how to address those things. This is just a sample agenda from MIT, and I'm happy to share these slides with you in a PDF if you'd like to look back at these and borrow from this idea. So this is MIT's way of running a meeting, and you can see how specific it is. This is how dialed in and how focused you can get in a meeting, meaning this is exactly how much time we're going to dedicate to this subject, who is going to lead the subject, and then how, what are we supposed to accomplish, and is this supposed to be the how? It could be a decision, the how could be getting ideas, how could be brainstorming, but figuring that out together. Being an effective facilitator, I think, is something that warrants just a bit more conversation in the short amount of time that we have together today, because it's different language than we typically use day to day when we're talking about business meetings. So here's what it takes to be an effective facilitator as you're running meetings in the workplace. Number one, you have to know that you're responsible for the process and how the meeting goes, not necessarily all the answers or the content. Meaning, if you're bringing multiple people in the room, the assumption is you need those brains and you need that brain power to come to some kind of conclusion or idea together. So you're just facilitating a conversation, not necessarily coming up with the answers or knowing the answers or the content. So that's where why the word facilitation is so important. You also have to hold the belief that informed individuals working together can accomplish more than I could accomplish on my own, which sounds obvious when you say it, but we all have an ego. And a lot of times in a work environment that's a little too siloed or people aren't working together as effectively as they could, we start getting in our head egoically that I actually know more than everyone else in the room. And it's a dirty thought. It's a thought that provokes guilt if we're aware of it, but it is there. It's a real thought we have. So you have to believe that we have all the right brains in the room. And if I can just bring out their brain power, we're going to come to better solutions than we ever have in the past. Third, you got to create the structure. This is something, again, that most people don't do. What's the structure in the meeting for the ideas and plans that team members can then create? It's amazing how much people's minds and abilities and good ideas open up when they have some structure, meaning less winging it in meetings, unless we've agreed that's what we want to do just for social bonding time. But the structure and the purpose and direction of the meeting are critically important for bringing out the best and brightest thoughts in people. And then finally, as you heard me say, if you're running the meeting, it's your responsibility to confront disruptive behavior in an emotionally intelligent way. And what does emotional intelligence mean in a nutshell? It means I'm telling you something authentically. I'm telling you a difficult truth in a way that lands well on you, which is a lifetime practice, right? It's very difficult to tell the truth and be emotionally sensitive and attuned enough to make sure it lands well on the person you're calling out or calling forth, meaning you're acknowledging them because you know they could be doing better, or you know they're not bringing forth their best self, and you're asking them to do that. When we're dealing with ourselves, this is the model of cognitive behavioral psychology, tweaked just slightly to make it easier to remember in this idea of STEM. The point here is that our unconscious mind, as you heard me say, that's the T in this model, is the reason for many of our reactive thoughts, meaning something stressful happens, my unconscious mind takes over and I start thinking really aggressively or judgmentally, and then I start having emotions because of that thought, and then it colors my behavior and disposition, which is manifestation. So if you'd like to field test this, this is something great to ask about at the end. You can try this on when you're driving on any freeway in Southern California, because something stressful is often happening, and it's amazing how negative we go in our mind, and then we start feeling things, and then it colors kind of how our mood and how we're acting. And it all anchors on that thought. Can we address that negative thought that's in our head in real time quickly enough so that it reframes how our pattern of thinking, reassures us we're okay, and then takes us into a better disposition emotionally and in how we're showing up in our mood. I wanted to leave you with a checklist. This is a checklist in preparing for great meetings that I'm happy to answer questions about or talk through privately. Number one, talk to your people, formally or informally survey them about how meetings are going and how they could be improved. Estimate the cost of your meetings. Talk numbers with people if you're finding difficulty getting leverage or motivation in people to make a change. State a clear purpose at the beginning of every meeting. Set a shorter time frame, like it doesn't need to be an hour. A lot of meetings can be done in 5 minutes. A lot of meetings can be done in 15. And then some do require an hour or even a half day or longer. Clear agendas, facilitate, and create clear and timed follow-ups. What are people responsible for, and what did we agree to do walking away from any given meeting? So again, I'm happy to send this to you. All you have to do is email me, and I'll make sure you get a PDF of this list so that you can use it to your advantage in your teams or your organizations. So that is a very quick, high-level overview of how to run meetings more effectively, how to think differently about meetings, and I'm happy to take your questions, and thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Dan, for your time. I do know how valuable it is. I've sort of allowed participants to chat or be able to ask any questions. Do we have any questions from the folks that are out there? Well, Dan, I have a question. I generally do. So let me, so one of the things that I have found over the years of me doing some of the same kinds of things that you have done that you do on a day in and day out basis, and certainly in instances where I've been running organizations, do you see difference? Do you see that that sales meetings are particularly wasteful, or do you work with sales teams to kind of help them increase the value of their meetings? And furthermore, let me ask a secondary question to that. one of the, salespeople sometimes are like herding cats. So what I have taken to is kind of having individual sales meetings rather than group sales meetings. What are your thoughts on all of that?
That's a wonderfully specific question. Couple thoughts. They almost could sound contradictory to each other, but I don't think they are. My experience working with sales teams and why they meet is twofold. On one hand, salespeople are typically working in isolation a lot, if not remote or both. So meetings are a way to bring salespeople together and fulfill some of that need to belong and camaraderie. Now, because like many, I'm stereotyping slightly, but some salespeople are lone wolves. So that's why it can be like herding cats, as you said, at times. The prototype of a salesperson is a high achieving, lone wolf, high performing individual contributor, right? But some of those folks still desire to be a part of a team and to have that need to belong and can come together for that reason. On the flip side, that can almost seem contradictory. One of the sales teams I work with, everybody's really competitive, and it's emotionally exciting for them to talk sales numbers in total transparency, because you get to see where you stack up every month and every quarter in hitting your sales numbers and hitting your sales goals as an individual contributor or a leader of an individual sales team. So those are the two reasons I see them getting together frequently. In terms of the productivity of that meeting and how well it goes, the one focused on vulnerable numbers and people getting to see exactly how they're doing in comparison to their peers and their peers' respective teams is probably the more productive of the two, because it's more clear to everyone why they're showing up, and it's clear to them what they're getting out of it, which is a typically motivation emotionally of some kind, given that they're inherently competitive. If you're not a competitive salesperson, you probably wouldn't have that same effect. On the flip side, those camaraderie meetings, that's typically not stated as the purpose of why we're getting together, nor is it structured enough for people to really know what they're getting out of it. So without being too long-winded, those are some of the underpinnings that I've observed in sales meetings.
Yeah, and those are great. I think those are great responses, Dan. It's a fascinating thing for me to watch, or to be around sales, in the sales meeting process, and I've over the years have struggled with it. So I go back and forth. There's a part of me that wants to throw the numbers up. I mean, I was a sales guy to start out, and my numbers were up on a board, and they were compared with to everybody else, and there's a part of me that wants to be doing that, and there's a part of me that sees it a different way. So I appreciate the input there, because it's valuable to kind of hear a different point of view. Are there any other?
Thanks.
If we don't have any other questions, then we'll call it a day. And Dan, I really appreciate it. We're gonna stay on the line, but if the attendees can would leave, that would be great. And then we'll catch you in about 6 weeks when we do our next one. Meantime, you can get this on demand on our website, and of course on YouTube, and we'll talk to you later. Dan, if you wouldn't mind hanging on, we're going to chat just a little bit on a different thing. So thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.